how's it going? About a month ago, I talked a little bit on my devlog about some work that I was doing to allow my entity component system to sort of have something similar to um, multiple inheritance, or maybe closer to like a composition model, where rather than having a strict hierarchy of like every entity has a single parent that it's derived from, an entity could choose any number of parent base entities to inherit properties from. So I did that a few weeks ago, and I haven't actually really taken advantage of it yet. So I thought it might be an interesting task to do on camera, to sort of go through some of the content that I have in my editor in the sort of the gray box test level for Gunmetal Arcadia 0, and start factoring out some of this content into, like abstract base classes. I'm calling them classes. They aren't really. Essentially, it's just a set of, it actually is just XML markup, but it's something that other entities can sort of uh, derive their specific details from. So, for instance, over here in my editor, I have collectible effects, player action. I have a few things already defined here, and this one, sprite base. This is what basically anything that shows up in the game world, anything that has sort of a physical position, anything that can be drawn to the screen, all of those are derived from this sprite base. And this has a few things. It specifies a renderable component, which that just basically means that the renderer is aware of it and will try to do something to draw it. It has spatial position. By default, everything has a z value of 5, which is, I believe, yeah, well, defaults to behind the player. The player is, I'm assuming, at 0 z value, although I would have to look that up to be sure, because that probably goes back to like the early days of you have to win the game, when I was just sort of stubbing out some of this entity component stuff. It has a camera component, which just means that it's aware of the camera. So like as the camera is scrolling around a scene, this thing will update its own position on screen to correspond to that. It has an animation component, which is sort of necessary for my animation entity tool that I think I've shown on videos before. If not, I'll show a little bit of that today. And then it has a sprite component, which basically means that its renderable is actually a single quad that gets drawn to the screen. And there's some rules there that tie into the animation component, so it knows where to pull its texture coordinates from, and how to, position and size that quad so it's, the correct size on screen for the number of pixels that this sprite has. So this is the thing that basically everything is derived from at the moment. And for instance, like let's take a look at one of my enemies. I like this slime monster. This slime was sort of the first enemy that I created for Gunmetal Arcadia. You can see here it's derived from the sprite base. And if I open up the base entity selector, that is the only thing that's based on. But there's this whole list here of other things that I could choose as its bases. Now, right now, because I haven't gone through the process yet of sort of splitting out all of the things that an entity, all the components that an entity might want to have into these bases. A lot of these are very specific things. There's really no reason anything is ever going to want to be derived from, say, a spider. But with sort of the process I'm going to be going through today, we'll start to see more content showing up in there that makes sense to have as base classes. So I'm looking at this slime, and in this window right here, we see the markup that is unique to this entity, to the slime. Over here, we see a list of any markup that is imported from its parents. So everything you see here, this is actually all the markup that was in the sprite base. And if I had additional base classes over here, like let's say I brought over some of these other things, and these can be reordered too. And whatever order these are in, all that data will appear in this window over here. So I don't actually want these, so I'll go ahead and remove those. But yeah, now if I go through some of the markup that's defined on this slime, we see the first thing in here is a class name is Xanadu entity. Uh, I say here, there's a comment that says this is not a component tag. Most of the top level tags that you'll see in this markup correspond directly one-to-one with components that I define in native C++ code. So for instance, there is a physics component, there's a bounds component, there's a GUID component. This class name is sort of a separate thing from that, and this is basically, it's a hint to the code when it spawns this entity that it wants to actually spawn something of a different type. So I have my base entity class, but then in code I can have things that are derived from that, and one of those is this Xanadu entity, which is sort of what most things in Gunmetal Arcadia are derived from, and that basically just provides a few functions as far as understanding that typically you will have components for things like, spatial positioning. Typically, you will have a component for physics, at least for characters that can, jump or fall or are affected by gravity. And the Xanadu entity class is the thing that sort of understands that all those things probably exist and tells them all to work together in a certain way. So, for instance, it tells the physics component, like, okay, apply gravity, calculate whatever our current acceleration and velocity are, and go ahead and integrate our physics. If we're doing like a fixed game time step, we can sort of interpolate our renderable position based on how far through the frame we are, that sort of thing. And that's all maintained in the Xanadu entity. The next thing we have in here is this GUID. I'm not sure I have any good examples. Well, let's see. I'm kind of jumping around here. Yeah, all right. So going back to Super Win the Game. In that game, there was no concept of procedural generation. Everything was all designed in a level editor that was very, very similar to this one. This one is based on that one. So I would place entities on the map here. And you can see, for instance, I have this slime that's placed right here. And if I double click on this, every instance of an entity that I place in the level, I can add additional markup over in this window over here. For instance, if I wanted that specific thing to behave differently from any other thing of the same type, so maybe I want this one slime to move a little bit faster or to have twice as much health. I could add some markup here that would do that. But otherwise, I just place it here, and in here it's all the markup from its template class and all the templates parents. But down here at the bottom, you see we have this GUID for entity instance and then some hexadecimal values. And this is automatically defined by the editor. Whenever I place an entity in the level right here, it just randomly generates a GUID. And that is the unique identifier that the game's serializer uses to tell that thing apart from any other things. So for instance, when I save my game and quit and reload, it uses that unique ID to be able to tell, like, okay, I saved this thing as having, half of its health, and it's at this position, and currently playing this animation, and all that stuff. And it uses that unique ID to match up whatever those deltas are from its default values to this specific thing. So with Gunmetal Arcadia, I was taking that same concept of knowing that I needed to have the serializer understand how to save and load properties for things that exist in the world, but not everything is going to be placed by hand directly in the level editor here. So that's where I came up with this concept of having GUIDs that are assigned at runtime. So for instance, I have this ag entity here, and this thing spawns slimes, and anytime it spawns one of those, the game just assigns a GUID to it. And the serializer treats that just like any other GUID. I think it has 1 bit set that basically tells it, oh, this thing was spawned at runtime, in case it ever needs to know that. But yeah, otherwise it basically works exactly the same. So let's see, going back to my slime here. Yeah, so we know that this thing we'll get a GUID assigned to it whenever it's spawned. The bounds component basically just says if this thing ever leaves the screen bounds or the bounds of the current room that the player is in, if that may be larger than one screen. But this basically just tells it, like, go ahead and delete yourself if that ever happens. So if an enemy ever walks off screen, it just immediately dies. There's also some other flags I can set here. For instance, for things like player projectiles, the axes that the player can throw that will sort of arc up. I don't want those things to get destroyed if they fly off the top of the screen. So I can tell it, like, okay, ignore the bounds at the top of the screen, but if it ever falls off the bottom of the screen or off the sides, then go ahead and destroy it. Physics is a big one. That basically defines how a thing reacts to gravity. It defines, jumps for the player. The player is an entity just like anything else. All the player's markup is also defined in the editor here. And things like, if you can double jump or if you fall faster once you reach the peak of your jump, that's all sort of encapsulated in this physics component here. And then we have some events that tell us, like, okay, if we've landed from a fall or from a jump, we can take some actions in response to that. And this system of events and actions is something that any component can sort of opt in to understanding. So you'll see these a few times throughout this markup. In this case, basically, it's just telling the slime, after it jumps, once it lands, it needs to start thinking about what to do next. And if it spawns, I may spawn a slime in the air and have it fall to the ground, or it may just start spawned on the ground. It needs to understand how to react to each of those cases. So that's what this event and action markup is doing. I have something commented out here, base role equals parent, that deals with for things like platforms in Super Win the Game, the moving platforms or crumbling platforms. Those things are considered basing parents, which means that other things can stand on them. And then once something is stand on top of them, it understands that, okay, if I move, then anything that is, parented to me or that I'm parented to, or however that works, needs to move together. I have that commented out here because nothing is allowed to stand on top of slimes. If the player jumps into one, the player will take damage and fall through it. Delete component just basically means this is a thing that can actually be deleted. You wouldn't necessarily always want an entity to be deletable, so that's sort of opting into that. Data is just a general way of allowing an entity to store values in a table that's sort of like a named key value pairs. It's a little bit of rudimentary system of. It's something that I added for Super Win the Game because I didn't necessarily have a better way to handle certain features I want to do. For instance, like, I want to know that, okay, you've talked to an NPC once. If you come back and talk to them a second time, they need to react to you differently. So I would say, okay, this NPC just has an integer value that starts at 0 and counts up every time the player talks to them. So if that counter is greater than 0, they react differently. And that sort of thing was just maintained in this data component. Most things have a data component because it's super lightweight, even if it's never used. But in general, I'm trying to avoid overusing that thing too much on Gunmetal Arcadia because it does end up being really, really wordy if I do too much sort of like game scripting in markup here. The facing component just basically tells it this is a thing that understands it wants to be able to face right or left, and you can set a default value there. Typically enemies will start facing left because I tend to assume the player will be moving through a level from left to right, and enemies should always approach them that way. But that can be whatever. Title component, this is the name that shows up on the HUD when you do damage to this thing or take damage from this thing. This also gets exported to a file that can be localized, and that I did the same thing in Super Win the Game for like dialogue with NPCs or dialogue boxes on signs or anything else in the world. that text would all get written to a text file somewhere that then you could go back through and localize. The health component, not only does this deal with specifying like the actual like health caps and stuff, this also handles things like being knocked back, being stunned when you get hit, and then, again, I have these events here where you can say, okay, anytime I take damage, play a sound. Anytime my health is depleted, play this, sparkle effects, which is a little sort of hit explosion thing that plays when you kill an enemy. And then when I die, go ahead and drop loot. And this drop loot action, anytime you see this action markup, this basically is it's a link to native code. In native code, I would basically map any one of these names to a function call and pass in, whatever extra parameters. So for instance, I have a function mapped to play sound, and it would take in, the name of the sound, the priority, which isn't really an important concept anymore now that I do have sounds playing over each other. But going back to like, you have to win the game, when I had like monotone sounds, I had to prioritize them so that certain things could stomp over others, and that's kind of just a legacy holdover from that game. And then I have some other flags there that says like unique means that the same sound can't be played twice on top of itself. So yeah, anytime you see those action tags, that's basically just making a function call to native code. And there's also another attribute that you could add to those, which is defer equals true, and that basically says wait until the current tick has ended before you act on that action. And I sort of that was a bit of a workaround I had to add back in, I think that was in Super Win the Game, to react to things like, okay, I want to jump through a teleporter and it needs to teleport the player, but I don't actually want to do that in the middle of the tick, because then I would end up destroying everything that's in the current room, including the teleporter itself, while it's still trying to teleport the player. And that caused a lot of problems. So I ended up saying, okay, I know that I want to do this thing, but I need to defer it until a later time when it's safe to take actions on things in the world. And mostly it is dealing with, when it's safe to delete things in the world. I have this loot component here, and this is definitely one that is a prime candidate for being sort of elevated to a base class. This defines loot that will be dropped when the enemy dies, or at any other time. Like you saw above here, I have this drop loot action, which could be played, in response to, maybe every time an enemy jumps, they drop loot. Maybe I have, like a silly little loot gnome that runs through the world and jumps around and drops treasure everywhere. So it could just do that whenever it wanted to. But typically my use case is an enemy dies and they drop loot in response to dying. So I have an opportunity tag, which basically says within each opportunity, I have a number of rolls. Each one of these is weighted, so it will pick a number that's sort of within the range of the sum of all these different weights. Wherever it lands in there, it will choose one of these and drop that thing. So you'll see here I have weight 20, drop is nothing, which means that there's a 20 of whatever the sum of all these things is, that % chance to drop nothing at all. But then you can also drop ammo, bombs, coins, gems, hearts, or keys. I can also have multiple opportunities in the loot table. And so anytime I do a loot drop, it would choose one from each of these. I have this commented out thing here with XP pellets, which was something I was trying. I apologize for the interruption. Apparently I muted my mic when I sat up and didn't notice it for like 10 minutes. So I'm going back now and trying to remember where I was in this video. I think I was talking about where I had these XP pellets commented out here. At one point I was thinking about having a system of experience points and leveling up in Gunmetal Arcadia. So I was playing around with the idea of like you kill an enemy and it sort of explodes into a fountain of like particles that are like these little green experience point pellets that you could run around and collect, which like on paper it sounded really cool, but when I prototyped it, I don't know, it just felt really, really bad for some reason that I couldn't put my finger on. And then on top of that, I don't really have any clear ideas for like a design for experience points and leveling up. I don't necessarily think that Gunmetal Arcadia is a game that would benefit from those concepts, so I've commented those out for now. Um, I think probably if I uncommented that, it would probably work. I could show it off, but I'm not going to try it just in the off chance that it were to crash everything. That would be embarrassing. Almost as embarrassing as recording 10 minutes of footage with no sound. Let's see. Continuing on, I have enemy name is Allegiance. This is another thing that's sort of sort of obvious candidate for promotion to a base entity. I have sort of a simple system of allegiances. The player is their own allegiance, enemies are an allegiance. I have an environmental allegiance, which is sort of like not really friend or foe to anything, and that system sort of determines like what sorts of things can take damage from other sorts of things. So like yeah, the player will always take damage from touching anything that has enemy allegiance. But then there are also cases like when the player throws a bomb, that can cause damage to enemies. It can also cause damage to the player. So that thing is actually considered like an environmental hazard. It's not really friend or foe. It's just a thing that is there and can cause damage to whatever. Um, we have this AI tag here, which that's kind of a big thing. I'll come back to that in just a second. The last one we have in here is the script tag. Scripts, this is just sort of a catch-all for anything that may need to interface with native C++ code. Um, for instance, here I have this on fully loaded tag, which basically this says like once the entity factory has constructed the entity, it's iterated through all the markup, spawned every component that this entity will ever have and attached those, loaded any deltas that may exist in the serializer and applied those to these components. Once we have our thing sort of completely formed and initialized, then we look for this on fully loaded tag and we can take any actions in response to this. So for instance, this is saying as soon as we spawn this thing, stop anything that it might be doing, which like if if the serializer had saved off the state of the AI, maybe it was in the middle of doing something else, and maybe we don't want it to. Maybe we just kind of want to reset to default every time we load the game. So we can stop whatever it's doing and then tell it to wait for a full minute. Our expectation there is, if we go back up here to the physics on land event, we expect this thing will like land on the ground as soon as it spawns and start doing something in response to that. So hopefully I won't sit around for a full minute after it spawns. But I did have a bug in there for for a while where it would do exactly that. But I think I fixed that one. So yeah, going back to this AI tag. This is sort of the heart of what makes enemies tick. And this is one that I think at some point I would like to break out into like a visual editor UI. So if I click on this Launch Entity Tool button here, you can see I have like an animation editor here, and this is what I use for creating all the animations for players, enemies, everything. This also has a tab where I can specify collision and tell like set flags for like what exactly this thing's collision is and what other sorts of things it wants to collide against. And so that's how, for instance, enemies can choose to collide against like invisible walls that are at the edge of platforms that tell them to turn around, which the player should not collide against because from the player's perspective, those aren't things that are there. But that's sort of a use case for this collision flags. But yeah, this whole thing here is sort of an example of something that at one time this was all just XML markup that I had to write by hand, and it was super wordy. It was a pain. It was really prone to breaking when I would like copy markup to start making a new entity and do things a little bit differently, and then have to remember, okay, I made a change to this one thing, let's go back and make the corresponding changes everywhere else. And it made a lot more sense to spend the time and effort turning it into like a nice visual window here where I can just like tell what each frame of animation looks like, and I can drag those things around. So like move each frame of animation relative to the collision box. I can move the collision box itself around. This is also where I can specify attachments, which is how like I spawn melee weapons in the player's hand, or spawn like projectiles or bombs or something when the player throws those things. So I have this whole visual window here, and I'd like to do something like that for AI in the future, because right now it is kind of these big wordy blocks of text, but I'm not quite to that point yet. But if I step through this, basically what the AI component does is you have a behavior set, and you can have any number of behavior sets. You can nest those too, but I don't have an example of that here yet. But essentially, each behavior set has some number of behaviors, and each one of those has a weight associated with it. And just like the loot drops earlier, we roll a random number that's within the range of all these different weights, and choose one behavior at random to start acting on, and then we basically just step through all the actions that thing defines. So for instance, if we look at this one here, the first thing we do is stop anything else that we were doing previously, and we wait for 0.15 seconds, start playing an animation where the slime shakes back and forth. Then we wait another 0.55 seconds, stop playing the animation, and then tell it to jump forward. And this is a good example of one of the reasons I would like to eventually move this over to a visual editor, is because you look at this thing and it's not really clear what this means. Like self jump forward, you can kind of intuit what that means, but then you have this 1.0, and it's like, well, what is that? And sometimes I'll look at markup I've written in the past and be like, I don't know what that is. I have to go look at the code myself. In this case, that's a scalar on how fast it wants to move forward relative to the foot speed that's specified in its physics component. So, that's a good example of where, like, if I had a visual editor, it could explain very clearly what that means. Maybe I could even have a preview of what the animation would look like, how fast it would be jumping forward, that sort of thing. But let's say after it does that, then it waits a few seconds, because our expectation is that after it jumps, eventually it will land on the ground, and the physics component will run this event, and that will tell it to play a land animation, stop whatever it's doing, and choose new behavior. So that's sort of a quick overview of like how the AI works and stuff. And yeah, so I guess this video is coming up on about half an hour long already. I don't want to make this another like super long 90-minute video, but sort of my goal here was to start breaking these things out into like discrete, bite-sized base entities or base classes. So I guess I'll sort of go through those motions, and hopefully I won't run into any problems where I sort of need to go make changes to native code as I'm doing this, but who knows? I actually have not gone through this process yet, like in preparation for this video or anything, so we'll see. This will be interesting. This is about how far in the video I was when I realized that my mic was not working last time, so I've been keeping an eye on the mic meter in OBS this time, and just making sure that I didn't hit the mute button again by accident. Alright, so what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to just copy all of this markup from the slime over to a notepad window. I'm just going to move that off screen here. But I have that over there, and that will, I'll just be copying and pasting from there as I go. So let's see, I'll make a new resource here. Let's see, the first thing I had was the Xanadu entity class. So I'll make an entity and just call it Xanadu entity. This does not have any base entity. It doesn't have a sprite sheet. It doesn't have anything. This is not something that I'm going to be placing in the editor. So it's just what I would term an abstract entity. I didn't talk about this export standalone definition checkbox. This if this button is checked, then when I compile the campaign to be able to play it in the game, this will create a definition file that the game can load. Basically, it's if I have that button checked, then it tells it that entity is a thing that can be spawned at runtime. So for instance, with things like slimes or other enemies that I need to be spawning at runtime, I would want that button checked. For something like an abstract entity, that doesn't really apply here. But let's see, I'll go ahead and copy over my markup from before, including the comment, just in case I ever forget how my own things work here. So that's a Xanadu entity. So now I can come back to the slime and say, all right, I have this set of available base entities. This is why does that have the so that little apostrophe next to that, or like the prime symbol, is what my editor adds by default if I tried to create something that already existed. So I'm wondering, it looks like I did already have a Xanadu entity in here at some point. So maybe I had already gone through these motions at one point and forgotten about it. Oh, you know what? In fact, I did. Over here in my editor, yeah, under interfaces. I had already split some of these out. I guess when I was testing some of these features, and I totally forgot about it. So let's see what I have here. Alright, so I do have this Xanadu entity already. Screen banded. Again, that's just the bands component. Data haver, it's just the data component. And then assigned GUIDs. Alright, so I had already split out a few of these things that the slime enemy wants, but then also that a large number of my entities will want. So that's nice. I forgot I had that. that will make this process a little bit simpler then. All right, so then up here in the base entity selector for the slime, I can go through and say, all right, I want this thing to be a Xanadu entity. I'll ignore that one that I just created. I'll go ahead and delete that one later. I have a bug right now where deleting things should work, but I do have some editor bugs, and I don't want to have a crash on video, so I'm not going to delete that right now. But then this thing also wants to be a data haver, wants to be screen banded, and wants an assigned GUID. And I can reorder these if I want to. I guess probably the Xanadu entity should be the first or second one. I don't think it actually matters to the code, but in general it feels like a good idea to put that one first, since it's dealing with how the native code will understand how to spawn this entity. And then I can go through here and delete all of the redundant code. I guess I'll delete that base role that wasn't even being used. Oh, my delete component, that one should definitely be an abstract interface. I guess that's what I'm calling those now. I had interfaces written down here, so sure, I'll call it an abstract interface. All this terminology, I'm using terms like multiple inheritance, abstract interface, base class, and really that's not what this is at all. It's just I'm sort of coming at it. I came at it originally from the idea of like object-oriented programming, when really it's closer to like composition, but I don't know, I guess it could be used in different ways depending on what I want to do with it. It's not really object-oriented at all, because there's no concept of like running functions or having like virtual functions where a derived entity could choose to override some behavior from its base entity or anything like that. It's just all it's doing is concatenating the markup that you see over here. So whatever terms I use, hopefully my intent is clear. Let's see, I will go ahead and create the deletable. And what was the other one? Oh, the facing component. I guess I'll, what I'll do. So I'll do one that's just a facing component, but then I'll do another one that is facing left. Cool. So now my slime can choose to be derived from facing left and deletable. And I can come in here and delete that and that. So now I have a title. Of course, that's unique to this thing because that's its name. There's no way that I could really abstract that out further. Health, I could probably abstract that out at some point. I'm not sure I'm going to do that yet for this video because I kind of want to wrap this up quickly. I will definitely do this one though, because I know that this loot code is copied and pasted all over the place. So I will pull that one out. Move that over to a loot dropper entity. Oh, one thing I hadn't mentioned yet, but this list of available entities here, this is sorted by frequency of use. So we're not really seeing the benefits of that here, but as I were, if I were to start using these more frequently, in different types of derived entities and stuff, then I would start seeing them show up towards the top of this list. So it wouldn't be the sort of thing like you're seeing here where I'm just like scrolling through the list trying to find like the one thing I just added. So yeah, add the loot dropper. Yeah, I'll want to break out health at some point. I don't know what I'm going to do with AI just yet. I'll go ahead and do one last thing which is the enemy allegiance. I will move that to another interface. And I guess go ahead and add that here. And that should be all good. What I'm going to do is do a full recompile, which should not be necessary, but basically that just prompts it to clean all the data and rebuild everything. And now I'll go ahead and give it a try. You know what, actually I'm going to delete this egg here real quick and delete this hanging slime over here because I just want to see, I want to make sure this one slime right here works correctly. So I would expect to see this thing walk around. At some point it should, play the shake animation, jump forward, play land animation. It does look like it's doing that correctly. I guess that's really all this slime does. It doesn't, it's not player aware. It's not really going to do anything more than just walk back and forth and occasionally jump. But, it does look like all those things are working correctly. Everything that we moved out to an abstract interface works. You can delete it, and it did not drop loot that time, but of course there is a chance that it doesn't drop loot. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop a few more slimes in here. One of these guys should drop some loot, as long as there's not a bug there. Yay, and there's a coin. So loot dropping does appear to be working correctly. So I would say that is a success. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to cover in this video. Obviously, there's a lot more that I could do with this. One of my ideas would be to take some of these things that are commonly used together. For instance, in the same way that the sprite base, I was showing that at the very, very start of this video, that already is sort of aggregating several components that are kind of unrelated, but it's something that basically anything that has a sprite that appears on screen, anything like that needs all of these. So I could probably take some things that are always going to be grouped similarly, things like enemy allegiance, loot drop, deletable, screen bounded, all of those things. Like every enemy is always going to have those, and I could group those together into like an enemy abstract base class, and then just have that one thing. And then rather than having to say, all right, the slime is now derived from like 6 or 7, whatever it is, 9 or 10 things I have here now, I could just say, okay, it's based on the enemy abstract class, and then if I make changes to what that thing is, then that will propagate to anything else that's based on the enemy class. So I wouldn't have to worry about, oh, now I have like 20 different types of enemies are all based on 9 or 10 different things, and if I make changes to what one of them is based on, I have to go remember to make that same corresponding change somewhere else. That's the sort of problems that I'm trying to avoid with this, and hopefully I'm not creating more work for myself. The nice thing is that this is flexible in how I choose to use it, so hopefully I'll find the best patterns that work correctly for this, and hopefully I'll make Gunmetal Arcadia and Gunmetal Arcadia 0 faster and easier to make. I think I'm gonna call it a wrap for that video. Thank you for watching. If you're enjoying this series, please consider donating to my Patreon. As always, huge thank you to everyone who's already contributed through Patreon. You can send me feedback. You can leave feedback below this video. You can also contact me on Twitter or on Ask.fm. My username is Pirate Hearts on both those. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.